yeah, with that, I'd like to welcome everybody to Hot and Steamy Compost with Joel Meadows.
That was Lucy's title, not mine.
Apparently has caused quite a bit of excitement in the community. Not sure what people are expecting, but it'll be about compost.
It's all.
And I think Joel's got his clothes on the whole time. Yeah, so my name's 𝘆ecie𝘂𝗍 and I work with the Hub Foundation, a small local foundation that focuses on local solutions to tackling climate change. Been involved in a number of projects over the years. And so if you want to know more about the Hub Foundation, you can Google them. I also wanted to start with asking my partner to please keep the noise down in the kitchen. I acknowledge that I'm in my family home. And acknowledging that we are, well, most of us here, and certainly I'm on the land of the 𝗁 people of the Kulin Nation. And yeah, I'm really wanting to take a moment to acknowledge this country that we're on and to acknowledge its past and continuing invasion and colonisation that impacts not only the lives of Black people, Aboriginal people, all of us, and the country that we live in, on, with. Yeah. And I also wanted to, I guess, in that context, acknowledge this kind of quite extraordinary time in history that we find ourselves in. And I guess a time where I hope it's kind of part of a great turning, not just of compost, but of culture, acknowledging our own part of what's come before us, the continued impact of all of our lives, and moving forward together in connection with each other, with ourselves, and the land that we live on and with. Yeah, so I also wanted to acknowledge that it's Sunday morning, and thank you for turning up. And being a Sunday, for many Sundays, a day of connection to spirit, to the sacred, to community. And so I wanted to start, I guess, with the notion that what we're doing here today is sacred work. And it's healing work. The work of composting is coming back into connection with the cycles of life. And to revel in the mystery, at least for me, in that transformation that happens through composting. Yeah, and to recognise our small part in the great web of life. And to me, composting is also radical work. It's taking a step out of the system that says we can take things away and deal with it over there, and to take our part in stepping back into that web of life, and to transcend the notion of waste, and to build systems that contribute to life. So that's my little intro. I also wanted to acknowledge the Mount Alexander Shire Council who've provided funding for this. This is one of 3 workshops. This is the last one, acknowledging the Mount Alexander Shire as our community representatives, our local government, place where we can enact the actions that we think are important to us through things like community grants. And I finally wanted to acknowledge and have gratitude for technology that brings us together. Amazingly, it's a great mystery to me. Sometimes it doesn't work, and certainly sometimes it disconnects us from what is important. But through this quite extraordinary time, it certainly connected lots of people. And whilst we could have chosen to have this at Joel's place, we actually made the decision to keep it open, acknowledging that it enables way more people to attend. And we do think this is important work, so we wanted to keep it open. And there's always going to be more opportunities for meeting in smaller numbers around a compost heap. Yeah. Yeah. So with that, I think thanks to let's hope the Zoom gods are kind to us. So yeah, I wanted to introduce Joel Meadows up there with that lovely green leaf hanging over his shoulder.
The banana. A banana leaf, at least.
Yeah, so I want to make a very warm welcome to Joel. I feel privileged to be hosting this call with Joel. Joel might say a few words about his own background, but I did want to say that from my understanding, I forgot to ask Joel for a bio, so I made one up. I said, Joel has been living and teaching permaculture for longer than I know, locally and further afield with series, and I'm sure in many other places. And to my knowledge, Joel collaborates with many knowledgeable people on a whole range of subjects, including passive solar house design, rocket stoves, olive oil making, co-designing, making bee-caring beehives, making marimbas, and a very long list of things. I also know Joel as a musician, a thinker, an artist, and a maker and restorer of beautiful and functional things, including a house in which he lives and grows bananas in central Victoria, and maker of videos along with his young teenage son. We'll see one of those videos this morning. And Joel's compost, I will testify, looks really delicious. And the food he and his family grow with it are testament to its functionality. I'm delighted to hand over to Joel this morning and have been hanging out for tips on how to improve my own compost. And yes, there really is a banana tree in this house.
Yeah. Thank you, 𝘁cie, for that, and thanks for inviting me to do this. I've really enjoyed the process, because although as I say in the video, I've actually been doing. I realised that I built my first compost pile when I was probably about 14, might have even been a bit younger. I worked as a gardener with an amazing Austrian woman who had this phenomenal garden, and she made hot compost piles, and I realized that's how long I've been doing it for. And so I learned from someone who was experienced at that point, and I then had to go and do it myself and learn a whole lot. But yeah, it is, as 𝘁cie said, there is science and magic at work, and it's an expression of death and resurrection, if we're going to have those religious analogies, just playing out in our backyard, because things have to die for our compost to bring life. But that's a part of that beautiful cycle that we play in that space, and it is both particular and we have to learn some particular skills, but it's also deeply intuitive. So what we've got for you is a video that basically goes through the process, which allows me to show you things that I can't just show you over Zoom. And I hope I've tried to present as much as I can, given that it's only been shot in the last week or so. So there's some aspects of making that I haven't been able to show all of the bits of, but we've gone around and looked at different ingredients and collected those and built a pile and moved it. So I hope that showing the video gives you a whole lot of insights that wouldn't otherwise, if I just talked through it. But I'm sure there'll be loads of questions at the end of that. So the time we have after that is for you to ask questions about stuff that is not making sense, or things that weren't clear, or just particularities that you might have found in your own experience, that you're struggling to get a particular bit right, or you're having issues with certain things. And yeah, I've been composting for a long time, but there's also lots of things that I don't know. I'm not a soil scientist. And we do actually have someone who's got a bit of a soil science background, who, if there's questions that 𝘁cie and I can't respond to today, we can pass those on to Bill, and he might be able to get into some of the more nitty-gritty chemistry stuff. So yeah, there's a, you know, we'll try and build with our community resource a greater you know, community knowledge about how we do this well. So I'm going to start playing the video, if that's all right. So I hope it should be that everyone will see this on their screen pretty much at full size. You'll probably still have a picture of my lounge room and maybe a couple of others, but you should be able to see still most of the video on your screen, and you should also have the sound, as long as I don't mute myself, we found out. So I'll try and be very quiet while it's playing. And yeah, so I suppose if you're having issues with seeing stuff, get on the chat and fire a question to 𝘁cie, and we'll see if we can sort it out as we go. All right, so let's start. Okay.
G'day, my name's Joel Meadows from the Green Hand Institute, and today we're going to talk about hot compost. Composting. There's lots of different ways that people compost. Plastic bins in the backyard, worm farms or compost tumblers, to home constructed bays, or even just piles where people fill up their compost heap in the corner of a garden. We're going to focus today on hot composting, which is a process that actually uses the microbes that are present in the material that we're composting to actually heat up and speed up the composting process. But there's also lots of reasons why people compost. Sometimes we're just trying to get rid of stuff from the garden or from the kitchen. But a lot of us are aware that actually if we put organic material into the bin that then gets buried in landfill, we're actually going to create methane, because that organic material is going to get squashed, and without the presence of oxygen, it's going to break down anaerobically. That's going to produce a lot of methane. So we get problematic amounts of greenhouse causing gases of methane coming out of our landfills because of organic waste going in there. So we don't want to do that. We want to process this material in our backyard. And also, it's really good stuff. If we've got a garden and we're growing things, whether it's vegetables or fruit trees or even just ornamentals, this stuff is gold. So we want to keep that organic material on site, but we want to make sure that we're composting as best as we can, so that we're not producing unnecessary amounts of carbon dioxide and definitely not producing methane with our compost system. So hot composting is a great way to process a lot of material, do it in a really clean and efficient way, and make super quality compost. So let's go through the process. So this is a hot compost bay. I only turned this yesterday, and it's already up to 30 degrees. I reckon by the end of the week, it's going to be pushing over 60 degrees, because we have our compost bays mounted so that they can go downhill. A lot of you won't have access to a slope where you can do this, but it's a way of us managing the turning of the compost where gravity's working for us a little bit. But regardless, one of the key ingredients that we need to make our compost system work is we need a volume of material, and we need something that can contain that. Now, theoretically, you could just do a big pile, and that would be okay. But usually what you'll find is that the pile will then end up being quite a bit bigger, because it doesn't have sides holding it together and creating a nice mass of material. So theoretically, we need about a cubic metre of material to make a hot compost work. You can go bigger than that, but it's really hard to go smaller than that, because what you start to get is not enough volume for the surface area, and it starts to not get hot enough and to lose too much heat to the surrounding environment. So cubic metre or a little bit bigger is a great place to start. If we go much bigger, you know, even 1.5 metres each dimension, we're going to end up with heaps more volume on the inside, and that's just going to take longer to build up. So usually something around the 1 metre to 1.2 metre dimension each direction is about a good place to start for a backyard composting system. Now, we've got timber and corrugated iron holding our system together. A lot of people use slatted timbers for the whole thing, and that's great because you do get more oxygen through that. But as I'm going to show you later, I actually don't think what the bay is made of makes that big a difference. because actually it's the way we put the ingredients together that are going to get the oxygen into the pile. So don't worry too much about what you make it out of, but even simple stacking up a bunch of straw bales can be a great way to start. You get air movement through those, they insulate the pile quite well, and they'll start to break down over time, and then they can become a part of the compost. That's great too. So something to contain the pile that's about a cubic metre. When we're setting up our system for holding our compost, it's a great idea to actually make 3 separate bays that can each hold a cubic metre of material. One to build up our compost in, the second one to turn into so that we do our first aeration, and then the third one to do the next turn into and for material to do its final breakdown and then be distributed to the garden. That way we can have one being built, one cooking and going off, and the other one being distributed to the garden, and they can each be running at the same time. Then we're going to have to think about the ingredients that go into it, and we'll think about that in detail. We've got to think about the carbon-nitrogen ratio, we've got to think about the moisture and the oxygen getting into it, and then we've got to think about the diversity of what we're putting together to make our composting work. When we think about compost ingredients, we need to divide them roughly into 2 categories, things that are high in nitrogen and things that are high in carbon. Now, almost all living material will have some amount of carbon and some amount of nitrogen in it, but they're in different balance. So what we generally do is say things that are, leafy greens or things that would go off if we left them in a pile or in a wet bucket or something like that, and would get really stinky within a few days. They're generally high in nitrogen. If they're things that are more dry and woody or sort of brown ingredients, those things are generally higher in carbon. And we kind of go from, extremes like sawdust, which is very high in carbon, has a tiny amount of nitrogen, through to leafy weeds or really rich manures like chook manure, that's really high in nitrogen and has a smaller amount of carbon. We're looking to blend those things in the right balance, which is somewhere between 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Now, how are you going to work that out? Well, it's all right. We've got some rules of thumb that we can work with that are going to get it about in balance. Straw is a really useful carbon-rich ingredient for our compost. It's readily available in our area. This is just a little roadside stall that's on the edge of town, but usually you can find them around the place, or farmers advertise small bales like this, or large squares and large round bales through the local paper. And because we've got a lot of farms in the area, it's a readily available agricultural waste product. One of the beautiful things about straw fibres or any of the other, like this is wheaten straw, but any of the other straws, is usually they've got quite good hollow fibres through the middle, and that provides aeration through the compost. So as we put layers of the straw in, we're adding carbon to the pile, but we're also allowing oxygen to get into the pile deeper. Okay, so autumn leaves like these are pretty fantastic carbon addition to the compost pile as well. They're, depending on the type, they're going to give us different kinds of qualities of how much they map down and how they work in the compost pile. But unless they're really big, wet leaves, they tend not to clump too much. Ones like this off these oaks are pretty light and fluffy, and we can collect them well in advance of our compost making because they'll stack up in a pile and can wait ready for building a hot compost pile. So they're quite versatile in that respect. Sometimes very wet, big plane tree leaves can actually mat down and become a bit of a problem in the pile. So we might need to run those through a mulcher or make sure we've broken them up before we add them to the pile. But this kind of stuff, that's perfect. It's going to be really good, and it's going to have a lot more residual nutrient than just a plain straw, and heaps more than something like sawdust or cardboard or newspaper. So a bag of roadside horse manure like this is actually just stuff that's been picked up off the paddock. So it's mostly horse manure. It's got a little bit of grass through it, but it's basically mostly manure. So it's the manure itself is going to have a carbon nitrogen ratio of about 25:1, but different manures are different. And what we have to watch for too is, does the manure include bedding material? And that bedding material will often be straw or sawdust or other ingredients like that. And that's going to mean lots more carbon and a lot less nitrogen. So horse poo like this is not far off being the perfect balance that we need in our compost, but obviously we've got to break it up a little bit because it will clump and not be very good in the compost pile on its own. And the other thing we have to watch for is, if you can, speak to the owner of the horse and see that the horse hasn't been wormed, or whatever the animal is, hasn't been wormed recently, because the worming treatment will actually damage the worms in our compost pile. If it's a pile of manure that's been left for a while, that worming treatment dissipates over time. But if it's really fresh stuff, we don't want to hurt our worms in our compost pile, so we might need to be aware of what's gone into it. Another kind of manure that's available absolutely everywhere is human manure or humanure. Now, it's well beyond the scope of this video for me to go into the details of how to compost humanure, but if you're interested, the Humanure Handbook is a great resource by Joseph Jenkins, and he's got great information on his website as well. But human waste has a carbon nitrogen ratio of about 7:1, so really high in nitrogen. And of course, if we deal with it really well with hot composting and pasteurization processes, it makes for a fantastic compost addition, but you have to know what you're doing and you have to be really careful with it, of course. At the end of a season in the garden, we've got a whole lot of things that we're pulling out. I'm just pulling out these old basil stems today, but these will be fantastic in the compost. They're woody material, so they're a little bit higher in carbon than they are in nitrogen, but they're actually pretty close to balance, and they're going to provide great aeration through the pile. So all this it's free stuff that we generate from our own gardens, and we need to deal with it. So it's perfect stuff to go through the compost. Some of the tougher stuff we might want to chop up, but if we make it too fine, it will compact a little bit more. So we want to keep enough aeration through it. So leafy green weeds or things that we grow in our garden are really useful to add to our compost as well. There's a range of ones that get called dynamic accumulators. Now that's not a technical term, but what it refers to is any plants that have deep roots that draw up nutrient from deep down in the soil and pull that up and bring that to the surface through their leaves. So when we collect stuff that has great root systems and use their leafy tops, we add that nutrient to our compost pile. This is comfrey, which is sort of the king of the dynamic accumulators, but actually there's a bunch of other ones that work for us that we might plant or might just be weeds in our area that we can make use of in our compost. So I'm going to collect a fair bit of this as we go. So some of these leafy greens, a lot of people would call them weeds, are really useful in our compost pile. So here we've got borage, dock, mallow. So lots of these things will be great in our compost pile. They'll be reasonably high in nitrogen. They're already wet and they're very rich in nutrient. So they'll be a great addition to our compost pile to balance up some of those drier things, like the drier woody plant materials, as well as the leaves and the straw. And these things will add diversity and nutrient complexity to our compost that we can't get in easy forms from other things. Grass and grass clippings are a common thing that people want to put in compost piles. Lush green grass like this is going to be higher in nitrogen, whereas drier, woodier grass like this will actually have close to the perfect balance of carbon nitrogen for our compost pile. So you would know that if we took lush green grass, particularly chopped fine for a lawnmower, and build it in a pile, it can go slimy and nasty. So we have to watch that. We have to cut it with some drier material as we layer it up. Whereas material like this could actually be cut and stored for a long time and would probably be fine. Might go a little bit moldy, but it'll be reasonably okay. So grass, depending on its different states, lush green or dry and woody, will have different effects and we'll have to handle them differently, but they'll both be really valuable. All the stuff that comes out of the kitchen, we divide into two main categories. There's the kitchen scraps, which is the peels and the trimmings and stuff like that. And then we've got food waste, which is things like ends of bread or, bowls of food that didn't get eaten and are scraped out. That stuff is much better if we can feed that to chooks or other animals, because then rodents aren't going to get their hands on it. We can put that stuff in the compost if it's an active hot compost, but if it's not, it is going to be a bit of a rodent magnet. But this other stuff is great in our compost. It's got a reasonably high nitrogen content, but it's also got lots of other sort of steamy, carbon-rich stuff. So that goes in regularly. And if we can get our hands on other stuff, so trimmings from a green grocer, or if neighbours have got kitchen scraps that they are wanting to contribute to your compost pile, go for it. Clay-rich soil is another one of those secret ingredients that actually, if we don't put it into our compost, we're really not going to make great stuff. We need to add some rich soil that's already been through a garden bed, and if our soil doesn't have a high clay content, we might need to add some clay as well. And this has a few different effects. It brings in a lot of the microbes that we want to process the nutrient in the compost pile, but it will also have a particular effect where it will actually lock up more of the nitrogen than if we don't add it. And it also has a slightly slowing effect on the heating of the pile, and that's good too, just to put the brakes on a little bit. If we did a perfect carbon-nitrogen blend with no soil in it, it'd heat up really quickly and it would collapse really quickly. So the soil interlayers into our compost pile will actually slow things down a little bit, but also absorb more of the potential that is there and make a considerably better finished product than we would if we left it out. Biochar is a little bit of a wild card ingredient that I'm going to add but not expect everyone has access to. Biochar is charcoal, but it's been made specifically to be a good addition to soil and to actually put carbon back into the soil in a really long-term way. So the difference between biochar and just normal charcoal is biochar is always light and clinky, and it doesn't have oily stuff in it, so it doesn't stain our hands. It will, with a bit of water, we can wash our hands of it, and we don't have oily residues left over. So this is biochar that we've made on the site with just twigs and stuff from our property, so it's a part of our bushfire reduction strategy. But you can also buy biochar now. It's becoming more and more readily available, which is great. But you might be interested in making it, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. But I will throw it in because it is a great addition to compost, and we've been using it for the last few years and having really good results with it. Seaweed is another one of our wildcard ingredients. Not everyone's going to have access to it. We collect seaweed and dry it out and bring it back to put in our garden. The beauty of seaweed is that it's grown in the ocean, and the ocean is where all the nutrient from the land ends up washing to. So the sea has all the missing ingredients that have washed off this depleted landscape that we live in, and the plants in the ocean are actually concentrating those nutrients back into their bodies. So when we bring those things back here, we're kind of closing a cycle where we're bringing some of that nutrient back here and growing food and putting it back into the soil. It'll eventually end up back in the ocean, but we can keep those cycles going for quite a while. So if you can get access to seaweed, it's a great addition to our compost. You can also make seaweed teas and then add them to the compost as well. If you don't want to harvest it yourself, you can buy commercially harvested seaweed, usually from pet supplies or stock feed places. But just check, there are rules around seaweed harvesting, so make sure you know what those are and try and adhere to those as you can. There are some really high carbon materials that we have ready access to. Newspaper, cardboard, and sawdust. Now, These things are really high in carbon. So newspaper has a carbon-nitrogen ratio of 175, sawdust 350, and cardboard around the 325 mark. Obviously, these are approximates. The problem with these materials is there's almost no decent nutrient in them, but we have to be careful. If they are making up the bulk of the carbon in our compost, we're going to have a pretty empty compost at the other end. So we might get our carbon-nitrogen ratio right, but end up with a real lack of nutrient diversity at the end of our compost. A lot of compost guides will talk about putting lime in your compost. Lime comes in a few different forms. This is ground up limestone, which gets called agricultural lime or ag lime, but there is also hydrated lime and there's quick lime. Now, we don't want to put quick lime in our garden or in our compost, but hydrated lime or agricultural lime can be used to correct imbalances in the chemical makeup of our garden and our compost. So if our compost is really acidic, adding lime will actually reduce that acidity and move it towards being a bit more alkaline. And ideally, we're aiming for it to be neutral, not alkaline or acidic. Generally, if our gardens are in good health and things are running well, we actually don't have to worry too much about our compost. When we're doing a rich carbon nitrogen balanced compost like this with lots of material in it, we're not going to end up with a highly acidic compost. So you can add a bit of lime if you think your garden needs it, but it's actually not super essential in a hot composting pile like this. If all you're doing is collecting kitchen scraps, then they're going to be quite acidic by the time you build up a compost out of those, and that's where lime can be a really important addition. But in our case, you can do it if you think your garden needs it, but I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the pH balance of my compost. I worry about it in my soil and correct it there. As our gardens start to improve, we can grow more of our compost ingredients on site. The thing we have to be careful of, though, is if our soils are depleted of nutrients and we're using those materials to make our compost, we can exacerbate nutrient deficiency. So that's where those dynamic accumulators and seaweed, special stuff that comes in from outside that can improve the quality of our compost become really important. We have our ingredients together, so we're ready to start making compost. We're going to start by putting a layer of dry woody material right down the bottom, and that's going to make sure that we've got great oxygenation at the base of the pile. And then we're going to start layering it up. Some people describe it as being like making a lasagna, where we're putting thin layers of the different materials and building them up as we go. What we're going to watch for is that we're keeping our carbon-nitrogen balance about right. And that's usually helped by just making sure that we're getting a diversity of different things in. If we put some nitrogen-rich material down, make sure it's followed by a layer of carbon-rich material. And we'll build it up until we get to the top and we've got a cubic metre ready to go. Some of you might like to build your pile in one go. Get all the material together to one big bay in a day and get it started. I find that that's a bit tricky to do, and it doesn't really work in with us having material coming out of the kitchen and out of the garden on a regular basis. So I like to do this system, which I call the 3/3 approach. When the top bay is empty, we start by filling it up with about 1/3 a cubic metre of material, and we layer it up in the lasagna style. That starts getting hot. It's not a fully cooking bay, but it's starting to get hot, which means that we can start to add things like kitchen and garden scraps in there in layers, and it will already start to be heating up. It also means that we're less likely to have issues with rodents because it's already getting uncomfortably hot for them, and that's really good for keeping our pile relatively clean. That next third of the pile, we can build up as we get materials from our kitchen or from the garden or other things we salvage, and we can layer it up slowly, managing our carbon nitrogen as we do it. And then when we're getting near the top, we can do that final third with just a collection of materials, and that way we've got our cubic metre ready to go. It might take a month or two to build up that middle third layer, but that way we always have somewhere to put our compost out of the kitchen or out of the garden, and we're building a getting ready hot compost pile that's about to go off when it turns. At that point, we've got a cubic metre of material and we're ready to turn or tumble, depending on what your system is, and actually get that material blended up and completely oxygenated. At that point too, we're starting to be cooks in the kitchen. We're looking at the ingredients that we've put into our pile, and we might make adjustments at that point. We might say, oh, there's not enough carbon-rich material. It's a bit slimy and a bit soggy, and we put some more dry stuff in. Or it might be that it's a bit too dry and we need some more manures or green leafies in there. At that point, we can still blend and cut it. We've also got to make sure that our moisture content is right. And ideally, our compost, when it's going through this process, will be wet enough that no part of it ever feels dry, but not so wet that we could squeeze moisture out of it. And I think of it like a squeezed out sponge, where it's damp to the touch, but we couldn't make water drip out of it. Now, how will you know that? Well, as you're doing your turning of the compost, you'll be watching for that. And if it's in the middle of summer, it might be quite dry, or the materials that you've put in have been more carbon rich, and it's just the whole pile's a little bit dry and not getting hot and not really looking very active, then you might actually squirt some water in there. You might add a little bit more leafy greens and nitrogen rich material as you're doing that turn to get it right. And so we're changing the material makeup if we're not happy with what we've got. We're also turning, so we're taking the center of the pile and moving it to the outside, and we're taking outside and moving it to the inside. And we're also taking a cross-sectional cut of all of our lasagna layers. So we're mixing stuff from the older stuff to the newer stuff. And the new pile that we make then is a complete mix-up of what we originally had. And that is going to take off. If you use the thirds technique, you'll still have hot compost going in the first bay, but it won't get really hot. So it's that initial tumbling or turning that will really get it activated, and it's likely to go up to 68 degrees or somewhere around that. That might last for a couple of weeks, even past a month, and then it will start to taper off a bit. Now, you don't need a compost thermometer to find that out. You can stick your finger in, or you can put a piece of metal or something like that in and feel the temperature in the core when you pull it out. So it's really just a feel thing. We don't have to get really precise about it. So that will start to taper off. Then we want to turn it again, and we want to do the same thing where we're mixing the inside to the outside, and we're taking a cross section of the layers and we're fluffing it all up again. It will probably heat up again if it hasn't rested for too long, and it will go up again, sometimes again to 68 degrees, but it will taper off quicker. And at this point, some magic can happen. What we'll find is when it starts to cool, it will actually get completely infested with worms. So there'll be worms running through the whole thing for quite a few weeks. If we can rest it for a month or more, the worms will work through the whole thing, and after a while, they'll mostly vacate, but they will leave a considerably better compost at the end of their visit, and we want to encourage that if we can. So we need our compost system to be open enough that worms can come and go as they please. They won't be able to cope with the high temperatures of hot composting, and they'll vacate as long as they've got access to get out. But then they'll come back in again when it's ready, and they'll work it over beautifully. So we want to encourage the worms to do their magic. Those worms will lift the quality of our compost several notches. And at the end of that, we've got top quality compost to go out to the garden, into our orchards, around our fruit trees, around our ornamentals, or wherever we want to improve soil. So that's the basics of hot compost making. I actually made my first batch of hot compost when I was 14. I was working as a gardener for this amazing Austrian woman, and I remember her dancing around crazily as we layered up the compost. There was something magical, artistic in the air. And as much as it's important to pay attention to the ratios and the moisture content, it's a lot about feel. In fact, Peter Bennett, in his book Organic Gardening, says, with experience, it's surprising how unscientific one can be and still produce excellent compost, developing after a while a reliable gut feel about mixtures and techniques. So get out there, start making piles, watch what happens, learn as you go, and keep doing it. That's all from me. Bye.
Thanks, Joel.
That's all right.
Joel. Okay.
I wasn't able to actually see chat that whole time. I couldn't get onto it, so I'm sorry if there were. I had the cursor over the scrub bar. Sorry. Hope you didn't lose too much information down the bottom there.
No, and just to clarify, I think you have put together notes as well, haven't you? So
yeah, so they should be. I'll once we've had the questions too, I'll add some of those and we'll get them out next week. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, there's a few questions have come in, and there'll probably be some more to follow. Please put them in the chat. I'll do the last one first because I was a little confused with this as well, and it was around the idea of kitchen scraps versus food waste. Some more detail around that, and I would also add my bit in that, you know, if you don't have chooks, you know, like we don't want that. It's really important that that stuff doesn't go into landfill.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, the distinction is really to do with probably the high value food stuff. So the things that, you know, like bread or cheese or, you know, uneaten things that we've prepared as food are quite different. Like they're quite rich compared to, say, you know, orange peels and choppings of stems and things like that. So that's kind of the distinction. But having said that, all of that can go in the compost. No problem there. It's just that the high food value stuff will be high food value to rodents. And a lot of people are, like, if you don't mind having a few rodents in your backyard, that's kind of okay, although it might bother your neighbours. So generally, to manage our compost well, we don't want to have rodents through our piles, but you know, they are there occasionally. They're around, so we also have to accept that that's there. It is very hard to rodent-proof a big cubic metre compost bay. You could try and sort of wrap it up, or you know, put a you know, fine bird netting or something like that under your pile, so worms can still come and go, and you've got sort of microbial interaction between the soil and the pile. But then when you came to scrape that out, you'd catch your fork on it, and it'd be a pain. It really would be. So chooks, and of course, even if you don't have chooks, if you live in a country area, even in a city area now, you're probably less than, you know, a couple of 100 meters from people who do have chooks. So unless you're a fair way away from other people, even if you don't have them, there could be other people nearby that you could interact with. So I generally go, anything that I would eat, or you know, is only just past what I would eat, I give that to chooks. But all of the other choppings and stuff like that go in the compost. Having said that, absolutely no reason why you can't put the whole lot in the compost. But that's why I introduced that idea of the thirds thing, because once you get a hot compost going, it's even if it's not a full cubic metre bay, it will start to warm up, and that can be enough of a deterrent to rodents.
Okay, so could it be that you potentially add those rodent foods at that point?
Yes, so that's the idea. So you start to get a pile going, and then you've got somewhere to put your kitchen scraps and food scraps in the core of the pile, because that's where it's going to be hottest. Lay it up with some carbon-rich materials. I'm not saying rodents won't come to it, but it's less viable for them to seek those foods out.
Great. Thank you. I've also heard that the particular foods, when I went to a compost workshop in New Zealand about rodent proofing, because they have a particular interest in rodent proofing there, that bread, meat and fat were the three big ones. So
and actually they're really good things to feed to chooks generally, apart from processed white bread.
Okay, great. So some other ingredients we've got questions about. I might just list some of them. We've got weeds, all weeds, any that you might leave out.
Well, let's answer that. I mean, the best point to get weeds is before the seed heads have set. Obviously, a good hot compost will cook off most seed, so that you're not going to then be putting that you know, seed particles through your garden. So we want to avoid that. So if you are harvesting weeds specifically for your compost, try and cut them before their seed heads have set properly. That's going to save you a bit of grief. Having said that, a good hot compost will actually cook off most weed seeds. But yeah, pretty much anything. And actually that's my point, is the more diverse a range of materials you can draw from, the more, because each plant has a different root system, a different set of things that it's drawing up to make its body. And some plants are, they'll have a fantastic boron accumulation, and other ones, will be really high in magnesium or something like that. So actually a diversity of things is really good. If we made a compost with, just one kind of nitrogen-rich material and just one kind of carbon-rich material, we could make a compost, and it would cook, it would go hot, but it would collapse quickly, and it would also be pretty empty. So it wouldn't be great for our garden. So diversity in the compost pile is paramount.
And would you go as diverse as eucalyptus leaves?
No. Eucalyptus leaves and a few other kinds of leaves are tricky, because the oils in the eucalyptus work as a deterrent. So one of the reasons why not many other things grow under eucalypt trees is because it actually suppresses lots of other plants. So those oils will work, they will stay as residues in your compost pile. They won't be cooked off by the hot composting, and that will remain there as a tricky thing to break down. The worms won't like them much. The microbes won't act on them that much. Eucalypts are a interesting one. But yeah,
on that same vein, is there, do you have any knowledge or point people in the direction of making a native plant friendly compost?
Yeah, so yes. Look, I don't know a lot about that, but we can tune our composts to be like, I said, the sort of, I accept that the technical stuff, like I truly do not know the carbon nitrogen ratio in my pile at the beginning or the end, but I know enough to know that it's working. But I also know that sometimes my piles come out just a little bit more powdery, and sometimes they come out a little bit wetter. And I can usually go, oh yes, I know that there was just a fair bit more woody, dry material in that mix. Now, I would think that as a general rule, because most of our native species have evolved to live on very sparse nutrient and often completely imbalanced nutrients in our depleted. And when I say depleted, I mean Australia's an old landscape. It hasn't had volcanic renewal for a long time, and nutrients have been washed off the land, and that's been terribly exacerbated by what Europeans have done here. So our use of sheep and most of our farming techniques for most of our short history here have been highly destructive to what nutrient would have been here. So a lot of that's washed away, and things like in Castlemaine, the mining was just terrible. We washed topsoil away. We ripped out a whole lot of plants that would have been holding stuff together. We lost lots. So it's a history. I mean, the nutrient deficiency of the Australian landscape goes back well past European settlement. It's just that we are low on the geological activity scale, but so all of our plants here or most of them have evolved in really tricky circumstances, and they've evolved to deal with low nutrient environments. So if we put lots and lots of compost on native plants, theoretically, we can overload them, particularly stuff like phosphorus. But in truth, most of us who've done any kind of native growing know that actually natives just grow quicker in better soils. They can survive in, like amazing things like, the 𝗲𝗲𝘃𝗀𝗃 wattle, which will grow in almost nothing and put out, amazing growth in a couple of years, and will do it on raw rock and clay. But you put it in a rich garden, it'll do it in half the time. So it's able to survive in a harsh environment. But yeah, and theoretically you can poison native plants with too much, too much nutrient. But I think for the most part that's maybe not that true. But if you're aiming to do stuff just for native gardens, or you're aiming to compost specifically for natives, I would make the whole thing more carbon rich. I would put less nitrogen in, and you might allow for the fact that would cook slower.
Yep.
And you would end up with a drier, woodier kind of material, but the natives theoretically wouldn't be overloaded with nutrient because of that.
Okay, thanks for that reasonably comprehensive answer. Okay, so some other ingredients. Citrus.
Yeah. So, and there's a lot of people will say, oh, you can't put citrus and you can't put onion skins and stuff like that in a compost. The reality is anything that has been alive, you can put in a compost.
Me.
Yeah, you can. And look, I've been talking about hot composting humans for quite a while, not in completely kosher burial circumstance. And I heard something on the radio the other day about people who are actually experimenting with that as an ecological burial approach. I'm just saying it up front. I want to be hot composted at the end of my life. I definitely don't want to be cremated unless it's in a rocket stove cremation, setup. But yeah, the reality is we can put, and I've got a friend who picks up 2 roadkill kangaroos when he makes a hot compost pile, and he does a 2 kangaroo pile, and those, he says it stinks. And I've had this experience where I've put, reasonably large animals in my compost and put them in the core where the hot stuff's happening, and within a couple of weeks, you've got nothing but bones left.
Yeah.
So
that covers the dead chook pile.
Yeah, that's right. A good compost pile will dispose of any living matter quite well. So orange peels and onion skins and stuff like that, no problem at all in a hot compost pile. Where you have to be careful is if you're doing a worm farm, and that's not what this workshop is about. But if you overload a worm farm with citrus, they're not going to preference that first. They're going to eat the tastiest stuff, and then the citrus skins are going to go moldy, and also they're pretty high in acid. So that's where, when I talked about the acidic balance of the compost, because hot compost piles have got so much carbon to balance the nitrogen, we're not really worried about them getting too acidic. Whereas if you've just got a compost pile that's just getting stuff from your kitchen, or you've got a worm farm that's just getting stuff from your kitchen, that could be quite acidic, and that can be a problem for worms. So hot compost pile, anything that's been alive, is okay. But yeah, if you, with the caveat that, something like a whole lot of eucalyptus leaves could cause you problems, or too much of anything could cause you problems. Yeah. But a little bit of it, most things will be fine. And I'd add to that too. Hair clippings, nail clippings, high in nitrogen, great stuff to put in a compost pile, but don't put a fat layer of them in because they break down slowly.
Great, thank you. And I would add that citrus peel is great fire starter.
That's right. Yes. Yeah, dry out and use as a fire starter. That's right. So sometimes those problem things have benefits elsewhere.
Yeah. What about different coloured cardboard, white cardboard or coloured cardboard?
Yeah, holding my warning about cardboard at all. I'm really cautious of. I had a few composts that I made when we were building our house where we just had lots of things being delivered, and we just ended up with lots of cardboard, and it was about the worst compost I've ever made. It was just dry and lifeless at the end of it, even though I'd put nitrogen-rich materials as well. There's just almost nothing there other than carbon in cardboard. So theoretically, yes, you should be able to put any real cardboard in, and preferably if it's been glued together with natural glues, it's not a big issue. But we don't know what the cardboard is being glued together with, so it could be a formaldehyde-based glue, and I'm not saying that is what happens, but we're getting cardboard from all over the world because we're such a consumerist society. We get things boxed up from all over the place, and although the standards in Australia might be high for that stuff, although they probably aren't, we don't know what's gone into those things. So yes, white cardboard has been bleached. Whether that's got residues, I don't know, but usually if it sort of looks brown and sort of wood-like, it probably hasn't had any bleaching done to it. And it could well be made from recycled content, which is probably good, but just watch for those, the plasticized layers, the waxed cardboard boxes, the old fruit boxes, the wax layer is a petrochemical wax. It's not going to kill your compost, but it's not going to be good for it, and it will provide a moisture impervious layer. So just if you're going to use cardboard, just keep it to an absolute minimum. And because we do have systems for recycling cardboard, it's probably, you know, as long as that is actually happening, that is probably a better thing to put our paper waste to. Having said that, I'm quite happy to put any, you know, if there's little bits of paper that feel like there are, you know, I'll throw paper in the compost all the time, but just not too much.
Yep. Okay. Coffee grounds, and then to the inevitable dog poo.
Yeah, sure. So coffee grounds, very high, good nitrogen-rich material. If you're getting stuff that's come out of an espresso machine, those little pucks can actually be quite hard to break up. But usually, if you do two turnings, they will have disintegrated by the end of that process. But it's good if you can, usually if you could say tip it into a bucket and wet it up, it will usually disperse those pucks, and then you could water that into the compost. But yeah, coffee's great. As you know, because there's still
coffee's great. Okay, dog poo.
Dog poo. All right. Dog poo, like eucalyptus leaves, has inhibitors in it that will stop it breaking down. Dogs have evolved that because they like leaving little messages for other dogs, and they don't want them to break down. So over time, they've developed certain things in their poo that mean that they just sit there on the surface and almost nothing wants to break them down. They're not poisonous as such, but if you put, you could put a small amount of dog poo through your compost pile, and it would, and particularly if it got hot, into a hot compost pile. And I would, if I was doing that, if I was putting dog waste or human waste for that matter, or even things like pig poo, which is a little bit more like our poo, like horse poos and cow poos and stuff like that. They're basically just like mashed up grass. They're pretty inoffensive. I mean, I was handling a reasonably fresh horse poo. They hardly smell. They're mostly grass. They're pretty inoffensive. Whereas human manure and chook manure and pig manure and stuff, which are much higher in nitrogen, they're getting a little bit into the, you don't really want to have them on your fingers. You want to be handling them with gloves and stuff. So dog poo is definitely in that category. You could put a bit of that in your compost, but you would want to be really confident that your compost pile got hot. So I would say if you're going to be getting down that track, get yourself a compost thermometer to make sure that the core and the sides of your pile are achieving safe temperatures. And by that, I mean, I probably should be specific about that. Let's see if I can find it really quickly. Here it is. In the Umanure Handbook, and I can include this in our notes if you want. This is it's the time and temperature. Can people see that?
It's a bit blurry.
It's a bit blurry. Okay. So what it's showing is this is the safety zone. If we leave things in a compost pile, it's got from 1 hour there to 1 year there, and then it's got a temperature scale up here. So basically, if we hold it, if we can get our compost up to 50 degrees for 1 day, we basically kill off all of the pathogens that will be dangerous for us.
Wow.
So if you were going to put dog poo into a pile, I would want to know that all sections of the pile have hit 50 degrees, preferably twice, and then I'd feel okay about putting it out in my garden. But if I had, say, 3 big dogs in a small garden, I'd be a bit worried about the concentration. If I put all of that dog poo into my compost, I would be a bit concerned about what that might be doing to just the residual things that stop that wanting to break down.
So what would you do with it, Joel? I know we've talked about this, and I'm putting you on.
Yeah, we have. I don't think there's a neat answer. I'm not sure what the policy is about flushing dog poo down a toilet, and of course, putting things down a toilet doesn't make them go away. They just go to a sewage farm where we throw energy and water at dealing with our waste. So it's not a solution. Obviously, if we put it into little plastic bags and put it in the landfill waste, it's just going to create methane. So it's going to be just as much a part of the problem. So probably if I did have a dog, and I think about this in relation to, you know, if people were if people are doing human manure systems and say someone is actually on medication or something like that, that might actually have residual effects on your worms, you might actually make a separate, slower compost pile. So you still try to get it hot, but you're actually doing a separate composting for that stuff that's a bit questionable, and you build it over a longer period, and then you don't put it on your food. So you might distribute it under eucalypts or something like that, but you don't actually put it on your food. And that way you're still not contributing to methane problems. You're reducing the methane output of it, but you're not risking contaminating that with your food.
Yeah, great for that. And I allowed, you know, I guess ask that question as well, because actually our third workshop that we'd applied for funding for was actually what to do with doggy poo. And then we decided that hot and steamy compost was far more attractive.
So much, yeah. How many of you would have turned up if it was just a workshop on dog poo? Some of you.
So I would just add to that I know that there have been some trials going on with worm farms. Of course, even worms, unless it's only poo, will eat everything else before the worms, but they will break it down. And as long as we don't anthropomorphize the worms and go, oh, poor worms, we can do that. And
how would you like being in a big bath of dog poo?
Okay, so anyway, there is more information about that. I know that Very Edible Gardens have put together something on worm farm composting. I mean, dog poo worm farm composting. Yeah. Okay, so
apparently there are a specific species of worms that prefer.
Segue. So there was a question about specific species of worms in the compost.
I don't manage that at all. That's a completely wild process, but it always happens. If I once the piles start to cool down enough, the worms come. Amazing. Now, if you were starting from scratch on a really degraded piece of land, you might want to grab some compost from some friends who had a really good compost, or even just garden, like that addition of garden soil will bring in probably earthworm eggs as well. Now, obviously, if you put that in straight away and cook it really quickly, you might kill all of those eggs. But generally, as long as there's access to the ground, and it's not a place that's been, you know, irradiated or something like that, the worms will come. And it might mean that after, you know, your third pile, you're going, oh my goodness, the worms are just going ballistic. Like the shot that I took of the worms, like that's been resting for several months now. And it's like, I found some worms in there for the shot, but actually at a certain point, that thing, I could have picked up a handful that would have looked like about half worms for that period. So they really do go absolutely ballistic. I use the word infested, which feels a bit like, I feel that's a bit disrespectful. It's a bit better than infested. It's like, you know, I don't know.
Highly populated.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do you know if it's hot enough without a thermometer, and how do you know if it's moist enough?
Yeah, well, there was a question too I noticed about too hot. And yes, theoretically, I mean, I've been looking into, because apparently there are circumstances in which haystacks catch on fire, they spontaneously combust, and you can inadvertently make a hot compost pile that does that too. Mm-hmm. It would probably have to be quite a bit bigger than a cubic meter. It would be, the volume has to be huge, and it basically has to, it's a very accidental process where things get wet and start to break down, but then dry enough that the pile can actually catch on fire, and you're getting certain microbes that actually will go above that sort of 70-degree mark. And that's pretty weird. That very rarely happens that you're going to get that. So if your pile is moist enough, your pile will not catch on fire. But as I said earlier, if you do a perfect balance of carbon nitrogen with pretty empty materials, it will just take off. It'll go really hot really quickly, and then it will actually, the temperature will start to kill off the microbes that are actually doing the work, and it will kind of collapse pretty quickly too. And it might, if you aerated it, it might go up and down again.
So in terms of the question, is it hot enough? I guess it's like hot enough for what? And so part of that is the weed. You've got seeds in there. And other than that, I understood, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's just about the length of time it's going to take. That so it's not a perfect exact thing. It doesn't matter that much.
Yeah. So I would say unless you're composting dog poo and human waste,
yeah,
you don't really have to measure temperature. Although if you're pretty gung-ho about putting weed seeds in your compost, like if you know you'd collected, you'd harvested a whole lot of heads of thistle and put them into your compost, you'd also want to know that you'd actually hit on those temperatures, unless you really enjoy hoeing and weeding. So yeah, under those circumstances, you might need a compost thermometer. Otherwise, you just got some rules of thumb. So I said, you could stick a piece of metal into a compost pile. So just a steel or aluminium rod, you put that, just a coat hanger even, opened out, push that into the pile, leave it for, 10 minutes or so, pull it out. At 70 degrees will almost burn you. You'll only just be able to hold on to it. 50 degrees you'll be able to hold on to, should be able to hold on to, but you'll go, that's pretty hot. Like, I don't want it to. So that's above 50 degrees, you're fine. You're making hot compost. Above 70 degrees, it's starting to be problematic. So you want to be in that range, but it's a feel thing. It's not super important. And for many years, I didn't even measure the temperature in my pile. I could just see that it was going off. It would, it'd steam in winter and it would go, and you'd see it sort of build up and collapse a bit, and sort of get smaller. And then when you turn it, it'd fluff up and do its thing. So yeah, temperature is only critical. You only need to measure your temperature if you're putting things in that are risky. Yep. Okay. I think there was another question about moisture. Was that the next one?
Yep.
Yeah. So moisture content, theoretically you could, there are those moisture meters you could use, and you'd want it to be saying, you'd be wanting it to register in the moist category. These are my moisture meters. So it does mean that like a lot of people will say, oh, you got to do everything with compost with gloves, and that's probably good practice, particularly if you're handling manures and stuff. But once you're starting to turn, these are great, amazing information gatherers, and moisture is one of those ones that you can feel really quickly. I mean, you can also see it. So as you're turning a pile, dryness looks really different to wetness. So use your eyes. If you're unsure, use your hands, feel it. You can always give your hands a good wash afterwards if you're concerned about that the pathogens on your hands. But yeah, you will the other thing too is that decomposition looks different to non-decomposition. So, a pile of twiggy, woody things can just sit there, particularly in a place like Castlemaine where it's dry generally, despite the rain we had last night. A pile like that can just sit there for years and nothing much happens, because it's just highly carbon-rich material, and there's virtually no decomposition happening. But, you put a pile of softer, wet stuff, and you see it breaking down. You can see the decomposition happening. So you can see moisture as well as feel it.
Okay, great. There's a range of questions about, do I need to insulate my, my compost, the sides? Is it preferred in sun or shade? And there was one other thing there about protecting it from heavy rain, and do I need to keep it covered at all times?
Yeah, they're really good questions. There's a lot of concern in composting things that I've read about the location of the pile. To be perfectly honest, that is true if you're just doing, say, a black bin or just a sort of an open compost pile. With a hot compost bay, a cubic meter bay, almost regardless of what it's made of, you really don't have to worry too much about it's the last week we've been under zero every night, and it's hardly topped out at 10 degrees. And the pile that I turned 5 days ago is now at it's over 50 degrees. It's about 55. So actually, it's miles hotter than the surrounding air. So yes, I could spend a whole lot of time trying to insulate that, but actually, it'll cook itself just fine. A major risk in summer is drying out, but generally, and I do put layers of straw on. So a layer of straw on the top works as both an insulator from the sun and an insulator from heat loss. So I definitely do that with a finished pile up a good layer of straw, or you can use things like carpet underlay or stuff like that if you have it, or felt or whatever. It will rot down. Actually, one of the best things is, you know, the old 𝗁𝗂𝗿 doormats. That's really good because it distributes moisture really nicely, but it's also a good insulator, and they will eventually just rot down. So if you've got an old doormat you can cover, or a couple, that's a really great thing. But I don't worry too much about that. In summer, I will water the top of the compost as a part of my watering rounds,
yep.
because it is going to lose to the surrounding temperature. Even if it was in the shade, if the air temperature is 35 degrees and dry as it is in central Victoria, it's going to dry out. It's going to lose moisture to the environment. So, and even if it's cooking, it might be cooking at a temperature above the surrounding air temperature, but it is just going to be losing moisture. So, yep, straw over the top, but I don't worry too much about insulating the sides or things like that. Having said that, that straw bale thing I talked about, making a bay out of straw bales, is great. It takes up a fair bit of room, but you do get both insulation from heat and cold, and good airflow. But it's mostly about the content of the pile.
What happens if I've got slaters in my compost? Is that good?
That means it's not wet enough. Yeah, so slaters like breaking down dead, dry material, and yeah, that means your compost isn't nitrogen rich enough. And if it gets really hot, the slaters should go. So that would be, it might, towards the end, you might get slaters coming in. So after the worms, or at about the time the worms come in, you might also get slaters coming in. Although usually I would say it's starting to be a bit of an indicator that you've made the whole thing a bit too carbon rich. So that probably means a bit more nitrogen next time, and it will make it a little less woody. And that they are an issue. If you put a lot of compost in your soil that's pretty carbon rich, you can actually have slaters being quite a problem in your garden. So you know, a few is fine, but a lot is a problem. And I'd say go more nitrogen rich, go wetter, go hotter.
Yep. Cool.
Yep.
And how do I know how often I need to turn my pile? Is it like weekly, monthly, daily, by the minute?
So if I'm doing the thirds approach, so that's building our first bay, so that where we collect the materials, I usually start by putting a third of the bay full, and that will be layers of carbon, nitrogen rich stuff. Then I've got somewhere to put my food waste, my garden scraps, things like that, and I will put extra carbonous material on top of that. And sometimes I'll get a fork and I'll turn that top layer a bit, but I'm not trying to invert the whole pile. So effectively, that system that I'm talking about actually only involves turning twice. So there's once when you've built the whole pile up, you give it a big turn, and that's outside to inside, inside to outside, cross-sectional cut through the whole thing. I hope people understand what I mean when I say that, because that way you're basically turning everything, you're turning it inside out, upside down, and making sure that the oldest and the newest stuff get blended together. So that's the first turn. The second, and then you get then it heats up, and once it starts to cool off, and that can be a month, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit shorter. Once it starts to cool off, it's worth aerating again. It's worth turning again. So that's the second turn. So I only do 2 turns. That's it. And you could theoretically, compost tumblers, those sort of cages that move, that you can make compost really quickly in those. So if you put carbon, nitrogen stuff in balance in those and turn them every day, you can make compost in like a couple of weeks, because aeration is a big player in it. But that's a fair bit of work. And for smaller volumes, that might be the answer for what you want. But hot composting is a different process, but it actually, even though those 2 turns are a bit of work, but that's it. That's your big job. It's the initial turn and the second turn. So timing wise, approximately a month after the first turn, you do the second turn, and then about a month or 2 after that, it should have had the worms through it, and it should be ready to go out into the garden. So if you've got 3 bays always doing something, you can always have somewhere to put stuff, and you've always got compost to take out. pretty much. There might be a bit of a delay when you do that second turn. And that's where a fourth bay could come in handy, but you're staying. And you could also, I mean, some people have another bay just for collecting materials as well. So you could go like 5 bays, but that's, 5 cubic metre bays is a lot if you've got a small property.
Thanks. So there were a couple of questions about adding wood, or what's the purpose of adding blood and bone or other commercially available additives?
Yeah. So, I mean, blood and bone is, it's a very rich material. It's got really high protein and nitrogen count. So if you were really short on, it also gets called dynamic lifter, is its other name. That if you might find that in a garden shop, it's called dynamic lifter rather than blood and bone, because blood and bone sounds a bit morbid, doesn't it? But that's what it is. So yes, you could add that, but generally it's not. If you were really short on nitrogen-rich materials, you could up the nitrogen content by adding blood and bone. But I would be more inclined to use that if you really needed it strategically in the garden for a particular crop that you were growing. I would do it then, or blend it with your compost just before you put it on the garden. There are certain things that do benefit from going through the pile. So like biochar, put it through your compost. Don't just apply it to the garden. That is actually a bad thing to do. Whereas a lot of those other garden treatment things, you'd want to target them for the particular crop that you're growing. So I would add those more in a more targeted way. But you can add any of those kind of garden additions in your compost pile if you want to, but just be mindful of what you've put in and what effect it might have on what you're trying to grow.
As well as, the effect of it having had to be transported, that it's packaged and all of that, and that we're really trying to contribute to life cycles, not to more carbon in what we're putting into our compost. Yeah.
Having said that, you can add blood and bone to your compost really easily by just putting dead animals in there. So if you find a dead bird in your garden, or, I mean, I've put a whole fox in my compost a couple of times. There's definitely been chooks that I've had to kill that I was unsure about eating that have gone in the compost pile, and all of that. What you don't break down is the bones. So the bones will come out of the compost at the end, but we just collect those. And when we have a fire, we bake those and then we grind them up, and they're really rich in calcium. And so that's blood and bone going into your compost. It's just localized rather than processed.
Yep. And what about wood ash from the wood heater?
Yeah. Yep. So ash is high in potassium. So it is one of those, one of the sort of the 3 big nutrients that garden fertilizers are based on. Yes, you can definitely put it in your compost pile, but note that you might, if you're burning wood a lot and you're producing a lot of ash and and that's a big ingredient in your compost pile, you could end up actually having too much potassium in your compost, and that can have that. The garden chemistry is probably beyond the scope of this workshop, but with any ingredient, if we have too much of one type of chemical in not chemical, but element in our garden, if we have too much of one type, it can actually throw the other things out of balance. Yep. So we do have to be careful. And if you're serious about growing food and you're growing, say, more than 10% of the food that you grow, I would encourage you to get a mineral soil test of your gardens and actually remineralize the soil back into balance, and then make sure that your compost is a part of that process. But that's complex garden stuff. But I would say be cautious of things like lots of potash. Yeah, potash is fire ash. Lots of that in a compost could cause problems.
Well, and also you need to save some if you're growing pear trees or cherry trees, to throw over them for cherry tree slug in the right season.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
I'm conscious of the time, and I'm wondering if you could say a few words about backyard compost and the dangers of actually creating methane if we do it.
Yeah, and this was one of the things that I really enjoyed trying to get to the bottom of doing the preparation for this workshop, because we put with our carbon nitrogen that we put into the compost, as I said, we're aiming to start at about 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, roughly. And then at the end of it, we probably end up with a compost that's more like 10 to 1, which means that actually we've cooked off a lot of carbon. So we do put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because the microbes are feeding on this stuff, and they're basically breathing in oxygen, breathing out carbon dioxide like we do, and they're getting hot, and all of that is actually generating carbon dioxide. But that's accounted for in the natural processing of what happens in nature. So nature, you know, leaves and branches and trees are falling over or whatever, and all of that is, you know, some of it's returning to the air, some of it's going into the soil. So we're doing that with our compost. What's of greatest concern is when we take organic material and break it down anaerobically and produce methane. That's our big concern. So when we have a stinky compost pile, we're contributing to global warming in a way that we wouldn't be if we were doing a good hot compost pile. So the thing to watch out for is stinky compost. We don't want to make that because that's amplified bad. Whereas the carbon that we do cook off from our hot compost pile is theoretically the carbon that's in cycle with plants all the time. In the same way that when we burn wood, as long as we're growing enough trees to meet that, then it's theoretically carbon neutral, as long as it's not a high energy processing. It's all in cycle. So that would be the same with our compost piles. But yeah, watch out for stinky composts.
Yeah. And I guess I'd like to add that, you know, most people probably know, but, you know, organics in landfill actually is one of our biggest contributors to greenhouse gases. So I wonder if doing a slightly stinky backyard compost is still better than putting it into landfill. I don't know. Is it?
Yeah, probably. And we could put that to Bill because he's got a better head for those cycles and what the effects of those different things would be. I'd be guessing that, but because you've also got the other stuff of just the weight of the material and the processing and things like that. But
and the transporting.
Yeah, I would still say, yeah, getting your compost slightly wrong is probably still better than it being buried in landfill. But with a little bit of knowledge, we can get our compost right. So.
We can. And how much wood ash is too much? That's like, say, how much per cubic meter roughly?
Oh, geez. I would say that if you're putting in, you know, over winter, let's say, if you're putting in as much ash as you are putting in, say, kitchen scraps, I'd say that's going to be out of kilter. I'd be wanting to put out, you know, ash maybe every 5 buckets of compost equivalent. But that's just like, I'm really just free forming there. But I would say it probably depends a lot on your soil. If your soil is crying out for potassium, maybe that's okay. So that's where you probably do need to get some mineral testing of your soils. And it's surprisingly not expensive. For about $100, you can get a really good soil test, and it will let you know where the balance of nutrients are in your soil and what you need to do to correct that. So if you don't know that, you're kind of guessing and you're flying a bit blind, and you can be exacerbating problems. And that's where things like a lot of composting videos and stuff will talk about using dolomite instead of lime in your compost. If you're on clay soils, which a lot of us are, that is poison. Don't do it. Don't put dolomite in your compost if you're on clay soils, because the high magnesium content of the dolomite will just make your soil go rock hard, and it's about the worst thing you can do. And people have, you know, almost destroyed their properties from dolomiting on heavy clays. So that's where a little bit of soil science, it can actually really help us make sure that and that the benefit of imbalanced minerals in our garden is our veggies grow so much better, you know. So good compost on nutrient balanced soils will give us amazing vegetables.
Okay, I think there's a couple of things that one was a comment, just waxed cardboard's also a great fire starter.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I mean, it's a petrochemical wax that you're burning, but then so's probably almost every other fire starter you get. Yeah, so stacking those up and using them as fire starters is good. Yeah.
And thanks, Chris. She says Buckwheat, she's heard, is high in potassium. Grow it in cutters as green manure.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. And there's lots of, I said that in the video, that when we get to a certain point, we should actually be able to grow a lot of our compost ingredients. So using those bit spaces in your garden, sort of the edges of pathways or you know, a little sort of unused plot down the back. So a diverse range of stuff like green manure crops. Sometimes you can get blended packets that are summer active or winter active green manure crops. Grow them, and you can cut them into the garden, but you can also cut them, put them into the compost, and process them that way. And that way, they come back to the garden, you know, fully broken down. And you can leave the root systems in the garden to break down. Really good stuff.
Mm. Yeah. Now, I know we're almost at time, and I know you said you were willing to hang around and go over time a little bit, but I just wanted to name, because some people might have just put aside this time. So I want to thank those people for coming if you have to leave. Also reiterate that we're going to send out an email, and also hopefully the recording for this will work, and also the video will be available separately. And I forgot to mention at the beginning that one of the things that got me into organising this workshop was that I'm really interested in the idea of creating some community compost hubs. So if anybody out there is really already doing great compost or wants to do great compost and be mentored in that, or just really doesn't want to do it and wants to contribute to someone else's compost heap, then please respond to, let me know in an email, because I'm really interested in hooking up people who want to really do compost and those that are wanting to get rid of their scraps. And I see Terry White here, and Joel and Bill's already been mentioned, and myself have kind of tossed around some ideas for trying to promote like neighbourhood hubs where there's great composting happen. Maybe even by, you know, our vision is every street has the compost going, and so we're dealing with what we generate in this life in our own places. So
none of it's going in the bin.
That's right. And I just see that Kirstine, who I don't know, but I did notice is involved in a community compost, has just commented. So really happy to, you know, really glad to have drawn in some of those people. I might, if people, you know, want to unmute themselves and ask a question, I think we're open to that now. But I did notice a couple of things that I've lumped together about, well, there was one question from Flynn, who I think came in late, so possibly the question about what would you put in each 3 bays would be answered through watching this. But there was also someone...
Can I clarify though, the 3 bays have exactly the same, because you build the 1 bay and that's all of your material, and then you turn it into the 2nd, and then you turn it into the 3rd. So there's not different stuff in different bays. I did point out though, when you turn from the 1st to the 2nd, you can adjust. And in fact, you can adjust on the next turn as well. So if you're not happy with your mix, you can then mix in other stuff as you're turning. So that does allow you to tune it. But effectively, there is only 1 compost. It just goes into 3 bays so that we can always have somewhere else to build things. Just to clarify.
Okay, so I can't see, unless one's just come in, and you...
I've got a couple that I think have been sent privately to me, so I will make sure I answer them. But should we? I think we have said if people need to leave, they can leave. But I suppose we probably should just say bye and thanks very much for coming. And yeah, I hope you've found it inspiring. I'm sure all of you have composted in one form or another. And yeah, all power to the composters of the world. I imagine a Shire and frankly a world where we never throw this stuff in the bin. It's way too precious, and we can make use of it in our communities in a really small scale, low energy way. And you know, that idea that not everyone has to have a big cubic meter bay in their backyard, but you know, every street should have 1 or 2 at least, and we can all contribute to those and then benefit from it. And if we're making top quality compost, it's a win-win. we might be arguing over who gets the stuff at the end. That will be the the distribution system will be the important thing.
Yes. So I wonder if you had a couple of questions, but there's also if you had time, or there was actually one that we missed, but I think the answer is yes. You don't. Do you need? I mean, no. Do you need to remove the roots of plants? And I think you covered that. No, you don't.
No, leave it. The chopping up thing, yes. And you'll see that the pile I was making, it's pretty woody. Like I chop things roughly, but I don't run them through a mulcher. If you did say run everything through a mulcher, the compost would happen a lot quicker, but you would also have a much greater chance of it matting and not being properly aerated and it becoming slimy and yucky. So I prefer to allow for it to be a bit more woody. And then if I've got chunks at the end that are just not quite broken down, I just throw them back up to the top. So they just go back through the system again until they're broken down. So I would prefer to do that than try and actively aerate the pile. And you can do that. People talk about putting like tubes into it, slotted tubes, or you can do things that actually sort of aerate the pile. And they're fine. And those, I'm not saying any of those things are bad, but all of those things, particularly if you put structures in the compost as you make it, that will make turning so much harder because you'll have to get those structures out before you turn, or they're going to be impediments to turning. So I prefer to make the whole pile more open and loose, and with more sort of woody bits that are going to allow oxygen to move through the whole pile. And I'll accept a small amount of that having to be returned to the top to get something that almost never makes the stinky mass at the bottom of it. You're muted, Lucy.
Thanks. That's because 𝘁𝗲𝘁's being diligent and doing the dishes.
Good on 𝘁𝗲𝘁.
Yeah, I wonder, do you have the energy to say something about if you're not doing a layered system, like just some basic words about other composting?
Sure, yeah. I mean, those black bins that I had at the start of the video, they're pretty common. You know, the council will often have discounted versions of those, and frankly, you can pick them up, you know, in hard rubbish often. So they're not bad. I mean, they're often what people would do is just tip the whole bucket of kitchen scraps and food waste into them, and then just that's it. They put the lid on and hope that it goes away. And it does, but it will produce a lot of methane because that stuff is very nitrogen rich. You're not balancing it with any carbon. So the trick with that would be, you know, you can't really build a perfect hot compost in those because you can't gather together a cubic meter. And the point of them is to have somewhere to regularly put things out, to empty your compost from your house into. But what I would do, I would definitely add layers of soil to those, because that will help soak up a lot of that nitrogen rich stuff that we will get converted into you know, methane and ammonia gas from too much nitrogen. We don't want to lose those things. So little bits of garden soil between layers is good. A little bit of carbon-rich material to just aerate it a bit. And then once usually you want to have two of those bins. So you would build one up over time, and then you would put a good layer of garden soil and straw and take the lid off and let them finish so that they're open, and then build your other pile. And then, you know, 12 months later, 6 months later, you could come back, and that pile's going to be, it's going to be different to the hot compost we make. It's going to be far wetter and sloppier, and you are going to have produced more methane, but it will be very rich. It'll be hugely rich stuff, but you probably then need to use it more sparingly or cut it with other materials a little bit more, because it'll be quite intense. But it's good stuff, and you will usually have worms working through that. So it is a legitimate way to compost, but it doesn't deal with if we've got a lot of carbon-rich material in the forms of leaves and stuff, you know, stems and stuff out of the garden and things like that. It doesn't really help us with that, because it would fill up too quickly if we put those things in, and it'll produce more greenhouse gases than a hot compost pile.
But I'm hearing that you still can you're basically doing a smaller form of layering as well. Like
you definitely want to layer. Yeah, if you just put food scraps in and put the lid on, you will produce a very, very stinky material, and you will be contributing to global warming unnecessarily. Yeah, so if you use them carefully, and definitely garden soil. Definitely garden soil.
Yeah, and I'm using mine now as actually storage for my layers.
Yeah,
so I put my straw in there, my cardboard in there, and so I'm aggregating things to make the pile.
And they can keep things dry and stuff like that. I use them for storing stuff too. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have some questions that?
I had someone asking about 𝘁 and 𝗂𝗃𝗃, so those very persistent grasses that often we are trying to get rid of out of our garden. Yes, I will put them into a compost. What I like to do, if I am pulling 𝘁 or 𝗂𝗃𝗃 grass out, I usually like to put it somewhere, like I like to upend it and let it dry out a little bit, because that's a great way of making sure that it can't activate again, and then I'll put it through the compost. If it was a really fresh, rhizome of 𝘁 or 𝗂𝗃𝗃, I'd be a bit cautious. If it stayed towards the side of my hot compost pile, it might survive it. So I usually like to dry it out a little bit first, and then yes, I do put it through. Yeah.
Same for oxalis.
Oh, oxalis is brilliant. Yeah, no, oxalis, you can collect armfuls of oxalis and it will dissolve into almost nothing really quickly, but it's a great nitrogen-rich addition to your compost over winter. I used to pull out my oxalis trying to get rid of it, and now I see it as a little winter bonus. It's I'm quite fond of it because it grows when and where other things don't. So make use of it.
You sound like a permaculturalist there.
Learn to love your weeds.
There was a question about, well, not a question actually, a comment about, Shire, Macedon Ranges, collects green waste, and I guess I just wanted to add a compost to that. Not a compost, a comment to that. I guess in our Terry, Joel, Bill's, and our collective opinion is that it's much better to do it on a local basis if we can, because of course the big truck going around collecting stuff and then taking it, usually like for our Shire it would be maybe 100 kilometres away to deal with it, is creating well, I'm not sure what the calculations would say, that you may actually be creating more problems. Having said that, if it's done in a good way and it gets the organics out of landfill, maybe it's worthwhile. But it's something that we'll be in conversation with our local council about, and possibly, I don't know, I just thought it worth mentioning. Terry's reminded me it may well be something that's dealt with through the zero net emissions transition plan that is currently being engaged with and will become more and more public in this Shire. It's just a survey that's gone out, but there's people having conversations about these things. I probably don't need to say any more than that.
In his book, The Intelligent Gardener by Steve Solomon, he absolutely gets stuck into municipal composting because he thinks it's atrocious on the whole. And my experience with it is I've never had any that's been any good. I think 𝘆cie said you've experienced some that was quite good. But what Steve Solomon says is that they almost never add soil because it's too expensive to add good soil to their compost. And of course, as gardeners, we've got access to good soil all the time, but they don't do that. And so that what usually you end up with is they're dealing with enormous amounts of carbon-rich material, a small concentration of nitrogen, and they're basically trying to get rid of stuff rather than trying to make good compost. So what usually happens at a municipal composting facility is, enormous amounts of leaf, vacuum stuff up from the side of roads, and dry material is then cut with the food scraps out of the bins, often with lots of plastics and stuff through it as well, and that then becomes compost, but not of the quality of which that I'm talking about and that we could make. So if we can do that at a small scale, street level kind of thing, I feel like we get the stuff out of the landfill, we get better quality compost, and it's straight away distributed amongst the people who are likely to be growing food, and we will make better quality stuff. And then we don't need another truck coming around and picking up yet another bin of our household. So I think that's good. But as 𝘆cie says, if people are going to throw stuff in the landfill waste, it's better that we have a big municipal composting facility. I just think we can do that better ourselves, distributed. I hope we can do it better ourselves.
We'll bring it to your house, Joel.
Yeah, please. I'm about to make another set of those bays because I want to make more, and I actually want to. Yeah. So yeah, sure. Come around. Drop your stuff off.
And I did say that I did find some good compost commercially available through Kyneton, and so I rang them to ask them if they make it, and they don't. They put together a great mix, so they're actually buying soil, not raw compost, but processed compost. They're buying materials from all over Victoria, and they put together their very own mix, which is good. Like, it's good stuff. But
Yep.
and you know, I do put it in my garden, and it's good because we have no soil here, and so you know, we are buying stuff in. But it's not. They're not making compost as such. They're aggregating materials from hundreds of kilometres away to make their product. Yeah. So yes.
A couple of other questions that have come to me. Someone asked about capeweed. Absolutely, I'd put it through the compost. Again, if you can get it before it sets seed, you're less likely to have seed than exacerbating the garden, but hot compost probably will kill the seed of it. And someone was also asking for clarification on the oxalis and their seeds. I've not had problem with oxalis exacerbating in my garden beds. I have it all over the place, so I am getting seeds around, but it's not coming up because of the compost. And someone also, Chris, asked, how do you get right to the bottom of those bins? I presume you mean those piles, but essentially they are like the way we have them is that they go downhill. So the bottom of this pile is at the top of this pile. So you basically just rake it out or fork it out. And it's the same. If you had them on the same level, you would just dig until you turn from the, take a cross-sectional cut, turn and keep working until you got to the back of the bay. So it's really just it's hard work. I think it would be a good thing if, people who are more experienced in their compost making had access to some really young, physically fit people who could come in and do the turning for us. Having said that, I enjoy doing it, and probably keeping ourselves active as we get older, that's a good thing too. But at some point, it's good to utilise some of that young energy to turn piles for us.
What about gorse?
I haven't tried it, but there's no reason why you couldn't. The tricky thing would be, how would you chop it up? Because it's quite like young green stuff. You could probably just chop up. I've got a machete that I use, and that chops things up quite well. You could run it through a mulcher. I'd just be really cautious of it. You definitely wouldn't want it when it's in seed. I think that they're very hard seeds, and they probably would. They get activated by fire, so I think they could probably survive in a hot compost pile. So I'd just be really cautious of the seeds. Having said that, you're going to notice a gorse seedling coming up in your garden, and you'll pluck it out pretty quickly. So unless you put oodles in, I think it should be a very useful resource, and we have a fair bit of it in our area.
Have you noticed?
Yeah. But do you also notice that under gorse stands, the soil is spectacular? It really does improve soil. So yes, it's going to probably have a really nice carbon nitrogen blend as it drops over time. It actually really improves soil under it. So yeah, by observation we can see that it's good.
And if we whippersnip the heads off the flower.
Well, we cut them before ideally we trim them before they flower each year. And that way too, we might actually go, well, we don't mind a gorse patch that we harvest from, as long as we've got it under control, as long as it's not going ballistic everywhere. We might go, oh, let's actually, and I mean, when I've pulled out stands of gorse, I've also been pulling out all of these beautiful nests and all of these things that the little birds nest in. So, we've got to be careful when we're ripping out things like that. We are also destroying habitat. So managing it carefully so that there's a succession of things for all the creatures places for all the creatures to live.
Can you see the question about sheet of gull at the bottom of the pile to ease, or the suggestion?
I I wouldn't do that, because you're really going to reduce the oxygen possibility at that point, and also the interaction between the soil microbes and soil life and the pile. I mean, they'd probably be able to get around. So you could do that, but the reality is that little interface at the bottom of the pile, like, you don't have to clean it all out, because it's actually, you kind of want to leave a seeding of rich stuff at the bottom of the pile, because that's where you're going to start building the next pile, and those microbes will be active there. If you scraped it all back to bare soil, you're kind of then almost starting from scratch. I mean, there'd be the microbes would be there, but it's a bit like leave the last, you know, couple of centimeters as like your sourdough starter. That's what starts to start your next pile. So don't worry too much about pulling out the very last skerrick of it. Just leave a bit, start the next pile. But no, I probably wouldn't. I think you'd probably find that actually it would be annoying. You'd kind of hit, as you're forking or spading, you'd kind of hit the corrugated iron and make a bit of a mess. I mean, you might be able to pull it out. Experiment. Do a pile with it and see what difference it makes. Does it help you? Did you notice a difference? I think if you left enough room around the sides, the worms and the microbes and stuff would come and go. So maybe it would. And the corrugations themselves might actually allow some oxygen in. Have a play. I think one of the tricky things with compost making, and Steve Solomon talks about this, he says, you know, when he makes bread, you know, or when he started making bread, he was making a couple of loaves a week. So he was learning really quickly, because, you know, within a month or so, he'd made lots of loaves and he got really good. When he brewed beer, he might have made, you know, a batch every couple of months. So it took a bit longer to get good at brewing beer. Compost making, if it's a cubic meter bay, it might take you half a year to make a pile. So as you experiment, it can take years before you've got, you know, 10 piles under your belt and you kind of go, oh, I think I know what I'm doing now. So that's probably where us getting together more and actually sharing ideas and helping each other build piles and watching what happens, then 2 or 3 people can learn from one pile rather than only one person learning from it. So that's, yeah, probably a great place to create more community interaction so that we can fast track our learning and you know, have 10 composts under our belt in, you know, a year, and then kind of go, I've got a fair idea what works.
Yeah, and as you've just called to mind, you know, if people are familiar with the hub plot in the middle of Castlemaine, there's a number of composting systems in action there with instructions and so on. So it's, you know, just behind the corner of Barker and Templeton Street. So it's good to pop down there. And, you know, looking at Faye and Terry there, because they're one of the few people I can see on the screen, I was reminded of Faye's compost making song that often comes into my head, and it describes almost everything you need to know. So I don't know. We should have included
that in the video. I didn't even think about that, Faye. I apologise. It should have been there as our theme song.
I wonder if there's a recording that we can send out to people. I don't know. Anyway, just a
We'll ask Faye about that.
Yes, there is. It's on an album called Singing Landcare, and it's available. But Lucy, I'm quite happy to give you a copy so that you can send it out to people, that particular song, if you'd like to.
Beautiful, because it says it all.
Yeah. And it's also got that wonderful line about next door's old dead cat in it, which I like, because it does remind us that anything that has been alive can be composted.
It's an Uncle Hedley's hat.
Uncle Hedley's hat. Okay.
Had to have been made of felt or straw, of course.
Yeah.
Leather.
Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in this community, a lot of knowledge, and a lot of sharing to be done. Is there anybody else out there that wants to unmute themselves? And Joel's got something else.
Just there's someone, Mary Kennedy asked, is charcoal from a wood burner the same as biochar? And can it be used as a substitute for biochar? Yes, for the most part, it can. I mean, the distinction is that but they're effectively the same thing. It's living material that has been burnt, but hasn't fully burnt away to ash. So it's burnt off the volatiles, which is the sort of the gassy parts of it, but the carbon-rich stuff is still there. The main difference between stuff that's, I mean, biochar is just charcoal that's been made with an intent to put it into a garden, and that's done in a low oxygen environment. So a wood fire is a lowish oxygen environment, but sometimes you'll find that you will get more of that kind of the oily residue stuff. It's not going to hurt your garden, but it's probably not going to be as good as biochar that's been made specifically. But yes, charcoal from pretty much any source can be added to a compost if it's noticeably oily, and by that it's like, you know, artist charcoal. Like if you could leave a mark on a page or on your fingers and it doesn't come off easily. That's what I mean about the oily residues. So if you had a lot of that stuff, I'd be a little bit cautious, because you might end up with some of those things actually inhibiting the compost making. Whereas biochar is just going to, it's like a growing medium. If you imagine something that's just full of holes and pores, and it's going to absorb a lot of the liquid goodness in the pile, and it's just going to provide accommodation for microbes. So they're going to completely fill it up and make use of it. And then that very carbon rich material will actually sit in the soil for sometimes thousands of years. So it is a way of us really actively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil, potentially for a really long time. And there's conjecture about the effects of it on our garden. Definitely its effects in depleted soils is better than on just already really good farmland, but most of us are dealing with depleted soils. So but it has different effects on sandy soil as it does to clay rich soils too. So do some research, but yeah, it's going to work really nicely in our compost, and it is going to lock carbon out of the atmosphere. I think that was the last of the questions that I've got.
My name is Catherine. Can you hear me?
Can do.
I apologise. I seem not to be able to navigate Zoom as well as anybody else. But I have a question. You mentioned earlier, Joel, accelerants. You were talking about comfrey and how that speeds up the process. Are there other materials that can be used to do the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And really, I mean, comfrey's kind of, you know, when people talk about dynamic accumulators, comfrey's the sort of often the first one that's mentioned, but there's a load of others. So borage is another one that's well known for that. But dock, I don't know if you know dock, it looks a bit like sorrel, but it grows as a weed in our area. And it has an absolutely enormous taproot that goes down into deep clay. So pulling the leafy greens off that will actually be drawing up nitrogen, drawing up nutrient that's been tapped by that deep taproot. And you can actually take the greens off it, let it sprout again, take the greens off it, and actually not pull the taproot out, and it will just continue to be a nutrient pump. So yes, it's a weed, but I will leave it in place to do what it's doing, and just harvest it regularly. And the chooks like eating it too. So I put any of those kinds of things into the compost. Because it's drawing up those nutrients from deeper down, that's harder for us to get access to. Does that answer your question, Catherine?
Yeah, it does, because I'm finding comfrey is quite difficult to access.
Yeah.
Very hard to grow from seed.
The best thing to grow it from is root divisions. So if you know someone who's got some comfrey, ask them for a clump of it from out of the ground, and you can break off any of the little root nodes, and you'll get a sprout from each of those. But yeah, I've found it took me a few years to get it to a point where I was getting good quantities of it over summer. So it's summer active, and it goes almost completely dormant over winter, or really cold conditions. Sometimes it will die right down, but it doesn't like drying out. So where I use it is actually at the base of my garden beds, where I know there might be a little bit of moisture and nutrient leaking, and I plant the comfrey around the edge of those garden beds, and that way I'm sort of catching water or nutrient that might be leaking out of my garden beds, and it's there as the final guard to capture that, and then I use those in the compost. But yes, in a really hot, dry position, they can just wilt in summer. But I also use them as a bit of a moisture indicator. So I expect my comfrey to wilt on a hot sunny day, but I expect it to recover by the next morning. If it's not recovered, I know that the soil is actually quite dry. So that's when I might start to, I use it as a bit of a watering indicator.
That's really useful because I recently acquired a bit of rootstock and put it in the ground, and it's all just died back. But I'll just leave it there and hope it comes good in summer.
It should come up in spring. Yep, you should get some active stuff popping up. You know, probably before too long, it'll go woo and start to send up shoots.
Fantastic.
Yeah, but you might need to, like, in wetter and richer places, it'll go ballistic, and people almost complain about it being almost impossible to control. In Castlemaine, I doubt you're going to have that problem. If you're in Central Victoria area, you're probably not going to have that problem. You're probably going to have to mollycoddle it for a few years before you get really useful quantities of it. But it depends. You might pick a moister, more nutrient-rich spot in the garden to put it, and then give it a couple of years to really get established. But I'm now at a point where I can kind of easily pull out a clump here or two and spread it where I want it. And usually it's, it goes well now.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, I noticed a hand up from Kirstine. Did you want to unmute yourself, Kirstine? And are you able to do that?
And Bron had her hand up too. Bron?
Oh, I can't see that. Okay.
Unmute yourself and jump in.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to say, if anyone wants some help getting community compost up and running, I've been running community compost hubs for about four or so years now, and we've tried lots of different methods. So we know what works and what doesn't work, and what works for one space might not work for another space. So if anyone has any questions and wants to chat about community compost, get in touch with me through the Compost Depot. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and our website.
Yep, I've already got a note to be in compost. You're in Melbourne, right?
Yeah.
Northern suburbs.
Yeah. So we're in Darebin, but
That's South Castlemaine, by the way.
Yeah. I do like a bit of consulting work as well so I've if someone says, oh look, I want to get this area activated and I want to have like a venue, like all the organic matter recycled and managed on site. I also work with restaurants and cafes and try and partner them up with someone on share waste or a local community garden, or find sort of solutions for people, rather than spending my whole day turning compost, because that is a lot of work. But I admire people who do that.
Great. I look forward to chatting. And yep.
If anyone has any questions
that's
about community compost, just send them my way. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Kirstine. And that reminds, did you have your hand up? I didn't see
Yep,
it.
I just have one quick question, and I think you've kind of alluded to it a number of times, but I just sort of wanted to clarify this. And I know it would differ with each compost pile you do, but the average length of time between each of the levels of composting, what you've found.
So the making your cubic meter is kind of up to you. You can make it in a day, or you can build it slowly over a year if you wanted to. That's up to you. But when you then take that bay and turn it, and this is again rough guide, I would usually leave that for about a month, but I would be paying attention to its heat curve. So it's the point at which it really starts to cool down again and fall off from its hot temperature. So usually a month, but it might be, you could probably fast track it and do it in 2 weeks, but that's going to mean that the next turn and the next heat up might be longer, because there's still quite a bit of material in there for the microbes to do their thing with. So usually I like to sort of wait for it to do that taper off and then turn it the second time. And at that point, probably in 2 weeks, it's going to have heated and it will taper off much quicker that second time. But I love to leave that for at least an extra couple of weeks, if not a month or more for the worms to come in and do their thing. So potentially, you know, a month and a half in that middle one and another month and a half in the second one. But theoretically, you could be building up this one while one's cooking here and one's getting wormed here. And then once you've emptied that, you can tumble that downhill and start that one again. So you've kind of could always have active stuff going on, because that's kind of the trick, isn't it? The stuff out of the kitchen never stops. So we've always got to have somewhere to put compost, and it's ideal if we can put it straight into a hot compost pile. But we could theoretically stockpile that stuff, but it's much more risky that it's going to get slimy and produce methane if we're just putting kitchen scraps in one spot. So that's why I like to have that pile, that first bay, ready to receive garden scraps or kitchen scraps as quickly as possible. And then the other ones can be resting as we need them to. But yeah, that's kind of, it's almost like 3 bays is a minimum to make hot composting work. It's pretty hard to manage it otherwise. You'd probably just get away with 2 bays if you had, say, a compost pile that you sort of semi-mixed and stored ready to put into the hot compost bay, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Well, I'm noticing the time. Please jump in now if you've got any urgent questions.
Otherwise, they can be emailed too, can't they? If they come up, and we'll try and collate those questions into the info sheet that we send out.
Yeah, and also something else I forgot to mention when the bulk of the people were still here was, you know, if there's, well, clearly there is demand for more information on composting. So this one's been available freely because of the Shire grant. But I know that, Joel, you offer workshops from time to time. Just keep an eye out, or maybe with the email list that I have with those 90 names, if there's a paid workshop coming up, I can let people know about that. Did you want to say anything else about that, Joel?
No, other than reiterating what you said about the hub plot being a great place to go for information sharing on gardening and compost. So Mondays, well, I can't remember the hours. Is it morning?
10 a.m. They meet to garden there. I mean, it's open to the public at any time of day or night to go and have a look. But it's, if you want to actually meet some other humans, 10 a.m. on a Monday is good. And I think Diana wanted to say something.
Yeah, it's not so much composting. It was actually if you were going to be holding another rocket.
Probably. We've been just holding off until we know what the restrictions are, how they're going to lift. But yeah, probably another one through Very Edible Gardens later this year, I'm hoping. But probably, do you know Very Edible Gardens and their website? Yeah. You could send a request to them, and they'll put you on the list for the next rocket workshop. Right. Chris asks about what can you use if you're not using dolomite on clay-rich beds. So it depends whether because the dolomite has magnesium, which clay is usually very rich in magnesium. So if we're wanting to add calcium to the soil, lime is one of the best bets, but that will change the acid balance. Otherwise, gypsum. Gypsum adds calcium, but it also has sulfur in it, so it's more balanced in its chemical makeup, which means you're not going to change the pH balance of your soil, but you will add calcium to the soil. So we use gypsum more than we use garden lime for correcting clay soils.
So you don't use dolomite at all?
Don't use dolomite at all. But I don't know what your clays are like, but be really cautious of dolomite on clay soils. It's a bit of a disaster. It'll make your soil go rock hard in summer.
Oh, I haven't used it a lot, maybe in the worm farm a bit and in compost making.
Okay. But yeah, I would use, if you're wanting to correct acidity imbalances, lime is the way to go for that. Not in our area. But if you're on sandy soils, the dolomite could well be fine. You're muted, Lucy.
Shall we say that's
Wrap it up?
enough for this morning?
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody that hung around for this extra bit. I've certainly learnt a lot, and I know that there's more to learn. So much gratitude for Joel and all the work you do in keeping your knowledge learning, you know, your knowledge rolling, and always, I really want to acknowledge how much work you put into learning so that you can pass it on. And I know that you get a lot of questions from people in the community about all sorts of things. So I just want to honour you as someone in our community who really contributes to the richness and knowledge of how we can live in a way more in harmony with the web of life. So yeah.
Thanks, Lucy. Thank you.
So I'm going to stop the recording.